At Digital Science, we believe that the best research is done collaboratively, and that is a value that the MRC's Laboratory of Molecular Biology also hold close to their hearts, as evidenced by the fact that they've created a whole bunch of groundbreaking research and produced a bunch of Nobel Prize winners. We're joined by one such Nobel Prize winner today, Venki Ramakrishnan. Venki Ramakrishnan, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm wondering, can we start with a pretty tricky question, given the breadth of your research career and all the amazing things that you've done? Can you tell me a little bit about you, your background, and your research?
Yeah. So I grew up in India and stayed there until I got a degree in physics. And then at the age of 19, I left to go to Ohio University in the U.S. It's in southeastern Ohio, to get a PhD in physics. And I finished my first 2 years of coursework and then started doing a PhD research under a supervisor, Tomoyasu Tanaka. And I was working on theoretical condensed matter physics. And soon after I started doing my thesis work, I realized I wasn't actually so interested in that particular problem, and it wasn't clear what I would do as a physicist. I didn't have a good sense. But at the same time, I would read Scientific American and other magazines and books and realize that biology was in a terrific state. It was making dramatic advances. And which continues till today, actually. Mm-hmm. And I knew many physicists had made this transition, but I didn't know any biology. So after my PhD, I decided to go to graduate school again at the University of California in San Diego. Mm-hmm. And it was actually worse than just going to graduate school, because in the first 2 weeks of my new second graduate school, this time in biology, I realized I didn't understand anything that the professors were saying in their survey lectures. Mm. You know, graduate students are given a survey lecture of research going on in the department or in the university, actually. Mm-hmm. And I realized I didn't understand any of the terms they were using. So I actually spent the first year taking undergraduate courses. So I'd gone after a PhD right back to undergraduate courses in biology. And I think that helped provide me a foundation for doing research in biology. And then in my second year, I started doing research in biology, but by then I'd acquired enough of a background and learned how to do lab work. And, you know, it was the first time I was doing experimental work. And I came across another article, and this one was on the ribosome, which is this large complex that translates genetic information. And it was written by two people at Yale. And so I wrote to them, and one thing led to another, and I ended up doing a postdoc at Yale. And that's what got me into my current line of research, which is, you know, now lasted over 40 years. Mm-hmm. You know, I've been a sort of ribosome biologist ever since.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually something that you won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for your work on better understanding the ribosome with a couple of other collaborators as well. Can you tell me a little bit? I
wouldn't call them collaborators. That's you know, and one of them was actually a competitor with whom I had, you know, very little to
Was
exchange.
That Thomas or was that Ada?
No, it was Ada Yona.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, tell us a little bit more about that, because we talk about research. You know, tell us about the kind of the competitive nature. Does it drive you on, or is it a challenge?
I think competition, I like to say it's good for science, but bad for scientists, because it's quite stressful. But on the other hand, it makes you work very hard, also think very hard, and so on. I'm now reading a book about the Manhattan Project. Uh-huh. You know, it's a fantastic book by Richard Rhodes. It was published about 30 or 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. And, perhaps because this movie Oppenheimer came out, but Oppenheimer is only one element of a vast enterprise.
Yeah.
And what strikes me is these people were terribly afraid that the Germans were going to get the bomb before them. And it just made them work ferociously. So I think competition does spur you on and does, make science advance much faster. Just like in business, you wouldn't want monopolies, you'd want, or you wouldn't want cartels, which is what a collaboration would be, that they're all, collaborating to set prices, for example.
Yeah.
So, competition is good in business. It's also good in science. But, many kinds of science require collaboration. For example, the Human Genome Project, when it was first done, was a collaboration, transatlantic collaboration, actually. And, things like, gravitational waves or the discovery of the Higgs boson involved hundreds of people and maybe thousands. And so there are kinds of science that require real collaboration, and others don't. And others are small-scale collaborations where you collaborate with someone who has a complementary expertise to what you have. And others are what I call fun collaborations. You collaborate because you like the other person, and it's more fun to work together. You can cheer each other up when things are not working, and so on. So I think collaboration has many different kinds, but science, we often talk about diversity, but science needs diverse ways of doing it as well. And some science is very individualistic, done by lone scientists thinking really hard. You need that. Everything can't be done as a group or by committee. And you also need, these large-scale collaboration.
It's really interesting. It makes me think of the space race being one example of how competition really drove progress forward, progress we still encounter on an almost daily basis in our lives, by the developments that came from all of those different discoveries of materials or ways of doing things or manufacture, whatever that may be. But then you look at something like the discovery of the vaccines, the mRNA vaccines around COVID, for example. And it was this focused, collaborative effort to solve one massive global challenge. I was chatting to my Uber driver
there was competition there too. There was competition among vaccine companies to try and get their vaccine out first. And it's interesting, a vaccine that came in third, even though it was really a very good vaccine, didn't get much traction simply because it wasn't first to market. So I think there are, even in there was competition that spurred things on.
I think it's really interesting you talk about the different ways of doing things as well, the diversity of the process of research. We chatted to somebody called Courtney Hone, who is, I call her the mother of moonshots, and she's one of the people that helped really build X, the moonshot factory over in California. And she is a big advocate for actually not racing to market necessarily, because being the first can sometimes pay off, but actually being the better option can pay off in the longer term. And so really taking time to nurture ideas can sometimes be what you need as well. I really like the diversity of doing things. It's a lovely way to see it. Can you tell me a little bit more about ribosomes? For a humble chemist like me that does not know much about biology but can just about understand a protein, why are ribosomes so fundamental? Why do we need to understand how they work? And if we understand how they work, what can we do with that?
Well, first of all, my research has been mostly driven by curiosity rather than about, what could we necessarily do with it. But I should say the ribosomes are absolutely fundamental. If you look at what our genes are basically information on how to make proteins, not entirely, because some genes code for RNA, and RNA molecules themselves there are RNA molecules which have their own roles to play. And we can discuss that later if you like. But many genes contain information on how to make proteins. And that information is copied to an intermediary molecule called messenger RNA or mRNA, which is what these vaccines, many of these vaccines are. And the mRNA is actually read by this large molecular complex called the ribosome. And what the ribosome does is it reads the genetic instructions, that is the string of bases that form the mRNA, which is really a copy of the string of bases on one of the strands of DNA. And it reads that string of instructions, and according to those instructions, it stitches together a protein from its building blocks, which are amino acids. And the miraculous thing about proteins, it's not miraculous, it's all chemistry, but is that based on the sequence of amino acids that make up the protein, which is dictated by the genetic sequence, the protein folds up into its characteristic shape, and that characteristic shape gives it its function. And so ribosomes are right at the crossroads between genes and the products that genes specify. And it's all these thousands of proteins that we have in our body, which are made from the thousands of genes that encode them, that we function. So genes are responsible for the very fact that you can see me is because of a protein in your eye called rhodopsin. The fact that you can take in oxygen and use it and distribute the oxygen to your tissues is due to a protein called hemoglobin, which is what gives blood its red color. And our skin and connective tissue is made of a long filamentous protein called collagen. And so I'm just giving you, antibodies are made of proteins. So just to show you the diversity of proteins that make up life. And every one of them is made by the ribosome. So the ribosome is absolutely fundamental to biology.
It's brilliant. I mean, hearing about your story and reflecting on what you said about how you explored something that you were curious about. You didn't think so much about the impact or the longer term ripple effect it would have on the rest of biology, on the rest of sort of scientific understanding. It reminds me a little bit of another Nobel Prize winner, actually, Harry Kroto, who, when he was working on Buckminster fullerene and buckyballs, he struggled a little bit at one point to get, a faculty position because the work he was doing was interesting, but because that application couldn't be demonstrated, there was a bit of reluctance. And I think we see that perhaps these days, as well as we need to declare potential impact for the research that we're doing when we apply for funding. Can you relate to any of those challenges or struggles? What do you think about?
Well,
do we give research
I've been very
space?
lucky. I've been in positions where, mostly research positions, except for a brief stint at the University of Utah, which is the only time I've been a professor, and where I was a faculty member and the School of Medicine, the biochemistry department there. But university, so the NIH in the US is very, very broad-minded. It realizes that basic research is fundamental to tackling disease. For example, we've made tremendous advances in cancer treatment, but that rests on understanding all of the fundamental biology of the cell. What is the way in which genes are regulated and they're expressed, and how does this whole process go awry in cancer, and what are some of the things that have to happen for a cancer cell to actually take off and produce cancer in the individual. All of that rests on a lot of fundamental biology. And I think here in Britain, the Medical Research Council, at least historically, has taken a similarly broad view. In fact, this lab, which is was founded by the Medical Research Council and still one of the, is one of the biggest institutions still directly funded by the MRC, is based on fundamental research. And yet, the slight irony is that the LMB has produced more wealth than almost any other biological institution, because this is a place where sequencing was discovered. This is a place where protein structure determination was developed first by X-rays, 60, 70 years ago, and more recently by cryo-EM. And it's where monoclonal antibodies were discovered. And monoclonal antibodies are a multi-billion-dollar business in the world today. So, 6 of the top 10 drugs in the world are monoclonal antibodies. And we're finding increasingly new uses for monoclonal antibodies. And all of that came out of fundamental research. So I think if you were to put a value on fundamental research, the value would be enormous, far more than directed research. Because while directed research can improve things in a field that's already known, fundamental research can break open entirely new fields and create revolutionary new applications. And that's the part that I think isn't made often enough.
Yeah. How do you think, in the current framework of research, how can we ensure that we make space for those kinds of discoveries?
I think governments need to realize that you need to nurture fundamental research, and they need to agree to spend a certain fraction of their budget on, high quality, really pushing the envelope kind of fundamental research. Some of it could be very high risk and things that are not likely to pay off. But if they did, they would open up entirely new fields. But of course, ultimately, the taxpayer is funding science only partly out of curiosity. It's also partly because they feel that science can lead to better technologies, better medicine, improve their general well-being and quality of life. And so we have to respect that, because it is money coming from the taxpayer. So of course, research councils and funding agencies also need to fund directed research. They need to fund applied research. They also need to make it easier for scientists and entrepreneurs to be able to take fundamental discoveries and be able to translate them into startup companies and nurture the whole ecosystem. But you can't neglect, the seed corn, which is what fundamental research is. And you can't artificially force people to write up bogus impact statements. This is just a kind of dishonesty, and people should fund fundamental research for its own sake.
I think that's absolutely right. We were chatting about this at a conference, an unconference recently on science and social science, and this is one of the really big things that came up. You talk about the challenge of translating research. We know there is so much valuable information out there that sits on the metaphoric lab shelf and does not get used appropriately, partly because it's not being exposed to the right people, partly because funding models at the moment won't allow for the next step of research. Do you think for the fundamental research and maybe for the translation of research, could you see more collaboration between maybe academia and industry? Could that be one way?
I think you need to change the whole culture.
Yes.
And the reason is, if you look at the Bay Area or Boston, you don't see this barrier. You see professors who are doing great fundamental work and very easily, starting up companies, or sometimes their postdocs will go off into industry and start up companies, and it's all around them. So this transition or this transfer of information is both frequent and seemingly effortless. Now, I think until a few decades ago, I'm afraid British academia had a certain snobbery that, we're not tainted by money and we're pure and that sort of thing. And it's only recently that it's changed. But now, I think even in Britain, there's tremendous entrepreneurship. But one problem is that young people, especially graduate students and postdocs, are not exposed enough to industry, to startups, to entrepreneurship. The only role models they see are academics. So they think that that's the default career option. The entrepreneurship idea isn't inculcated in them from a very early stage. Then they become slowly aware of it, and they sometimes see it as an option if academia doesn't work out, which is the wrong way to look at it. It should be an equal option depending on their particular interest and aptitude.
Absolutely. I think it was actually the Royal Society. You were a former president of the Royal Society, and I think it was one of your reports that showcased just the stark numbers of people that actually stay within a research and an academic research career versus the number that start. And it really tails off so quickly. But I do think you're right. At the moment, we tend to expose researchers, whether they're PhD students, postdocs, to this idea and the training regime that will train them to become academic researchers. And we train them in very little else at the moment. Do you think that needs to change? Because the bulk of research does happen outside of academia. All of these amazing graduates go on to have influence in a range of different careers. What do you think we need to do?
I wouldn't train them differently, because you do need that very rigorous training in doing science and doing research, and that's going to serve you well whether you're in academia or industry. Whether you're in industry, you still have to do essentially rigorous science and rigorous research. So I wouldn't necessarily change the training, but what I would do is expose them more to alternatives and expose them more to possibilities in entrepreneurship, so that they're constantly, their mind is open to other possibilities. And it's not just entrepreneurship. There are other careers in science. There's public engagement, there's policy, science policy, there's work in government, international organizations, science organizations, publishing. So there are many careers in science. And I think it would be useful to have either workshops or people just coming and giving talks about all of these alternatives, so that people are generally aware. But in the end, it's only going to change if we build up broad ecosystems around academic centers. And that's what the U.S. has done very well, and Israel is another example of a place that's done really well. Other places that have done it well are places like Singapore. And I was impressed that in China now, there are lots of incubators and startups embedded within university campuses. And so that then exposes people who are students or postdocs to that ecosystem around them. And I think that's a way to have it happen naturally.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So I wanted to maybe touch on, again, your role as president of the Royal Society, because these interdisciplinary societies that do engage with researchers, with policymakers, with industry, could provide, and I think do provide that fundamental platform on which to have that cross-segment engagement. Do you think we need more of that? And can we utilize those societies better? Can we engage with them more as researchers?
Well, societies like the Royal Society can play a leadership role by bringing together different segments of the scientific community government, industry, academia, others. But I think ultimately it's going to require a large-scale change. Now, the thing that's happened in Britain in the last few decades is we now have lots of entrepreneurship around. For example, in Cambridge has a number of science parks. One difference between Cambridge and, say, Boston is that in Boston, a huge amount of startups and industry are concentrated within 1 square mile in Kendall Square around MIT. So you leave your MIT building and you're in the middle of it all right there. I think one problem with Cambridge is that it's a bit spread out. You have the science park in the north, and then you have a bunch of science park, but they're all several miles or sometimes many miles away from each other, and you have to drive to get there. They're not sort of within walking distance. So I think it'd be good to have a concentration of startups around academic centers within walking distance, within, so that they can all communicate very easily with each other. And I think that's the kind of thing that can really change people's perception about opportunities, about career paths.
Yeah. May I ask you something that I certainly will never experience, and so I'd love to hear what this was like for you. You won the Nobel Prize in chemistry. Very few people will ever win a Nobel Prize. Can you share with us what that experience was like for you, how you found out, what that felt like? How did you celebrate?
Well, it's funny because people think of the Nobel Prize as a thing, but it doesn't just happen. It's often the culmination of lots of other things. For example, you get elected to your National Academy. You get other awards, which are often run-ups to the Nobel Prize. It's a bit like, you have the Golden Globes or the BAFTAs, and then, end up with the Oscars or something. And I think, this whole thing creates a sort of sports mentality to science. It treats science as if it's some sort of sporting competition. But, in sports, you can measure in a 100-meter race who came first, who came second, who came third. Sometimes it's very, very, the difference is very small, but at least you can measure it. And there's also a rule for how you measure it. But in science, it isn't like that, so science is multidimensional, and it's not often straightforward to say, oh, these are the top 3 who did it, because they often contributed in different ways. There may be other people who made different contributions, and also these 3 people's contributions often rests on other people's contributions. So I'm although I've benefited enormously from the prize in terms of visibility and so on, you probably wouldn't be interviewing me today if I didn't have one. Although I did benefit a lot from it, I do think it creates a slightly false impression about science. The one good thing you can say is that maybe it draws attention to science. At least the Nobels have enough visibility that once a year people pay some attention to fundamental. And also, the Nobel doesn't care about whether it's applied or fundamental. Its discovery, it's been awarded for very basic discoveries for most of its career. And so it does, give the public a sense of what science is about. So that's probably the one good thing. But it has some very negative aspects in terms of, we talked about competition earlier. People are instinctively competitive anyway, and awards make it even worse.
Yeah. That's really interesting, actually. And I like that you sort of told that story of the snowball effect almost, the BAFTAs, the Golden Globes, the ultimate Oscars of
so to get back to your thing, get back to your original question, there were a number of awards for the ribosome, and most of them went to other people and not to me. Wow. And so, and I also had an altercation with a Swedish scientist who was a ribosome scientist, very, very good scientist, but we didn't agree on a particular aspect of how the ribosome works. And it turned out he was appointed to the Nobel Committee. So I simply, in my mind, I dismissed the idea that I would ever get it, because, these run-up awards often went to other people. So I thought, well, the community doesn't think I'm in the same class as these other people. And, that might be disappointing, but, that's life. And then there was this other weird occurrence of this altercation. And so I was very surprised to receive that phone call that day. In fact, I didn't quite believe it. I thought it was some sort of prank.
Oh, my God.
And of course, that turned out not to be an uncommon reaction, apparently. But anyway, that's how I felt.
Wow. So you had an inkling that it may happen?
Oh, I thought the ribosome was a very good candidate for the Nobel Prize, but it's restricted to 3 people. And so it wasn't at all clear that I would be one of the 3, since many of these other awards for the ribosome had gone to other people.
And, there are the very formal things that then happen. You will have interviews, you will have to attend press conferences, you will go to certain ceremonies. How did you, Venki, the physicist turned biologist, now Nobel Prize winning, chemist, how did you celebrate? How do you celebrate something like that?
Well, the LMB has a tradition. They have a champagne party on the afternoon of the award announcement. So the entire LMB gathered up in the canteen on the top floor of it wasn't this building, it was the old building. And, so it was kind of fun for everybody to have a good time. And one thing about the LMB I like is because it's block funded, it doesn't have these turf wars and internecine rivalries that often characterize many academic institutions. Because if somebody does well, it's good for the LMB, so the LMB gets more secure funding, and it's good for everybody.
Yeah.
So we take pleasure in each other's successes, and I think that that attitude was really brought out in these Nobel celebrations. The LMB has won many Nobel Prizes, and each time there's a sort of lab-wide celebration.
I love that. The idea of all these Nobel laureates going, we've got another one, everyone. This is great. But it just goes to show the productivity of this kind of setup, this different way of doing research.
Yeah, and of course, the Nobel Prize is not a goal of the lab. We could, the lab once went, I think, almost 20 years without one. Okay? And it didn't matter. The point is that the LMB likes to support challenging fundamental problems. And the Nobel Prizes are an occasional byproduct of that way of doing science.
Yeah, it's brilliant. I'm going to wrap up with one final question. If you had a magic wand and you could do one thing to make research even better, what would you choose to do? What would you choose to change?
That's very hard to answer. I don't know. I think if you look at how amazingly well science is done, and the progress in just the last century alone is just astonishing. And the number of scientists has grown, the whole enterprise has grown, discoveries are being made at an increasingly rapid pace. So I'm not sure, what else maybe we're doing a lot of things right.
Yeah.
And that's why it's working. And of course, we always want things to be better, so we're always complaining.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that I'm not one of those people who feels that science is broken. I see young people doing, brilliant science all over the world, and science flourishing in many different countries, increasing number of countries. So I think, maybe we should be thinking about improving humanity and avoiding wars and social injustices and things like that. I think those are more pressing problems than, changing science. So
I think that's a perfect way to wrap this interview. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your time.